When it comes to designing a good visualization for communication, there are more things that we need to consider other than the encoding of the data. Remember the elements of any visualization that I explained in week number 1, right? We have the scaffolding, we have the frame, we also have the content, the encoding, but then also we have the design itself of the visualization and also the annotations, and we will get to those in just 1 minute. For now, I would like to talk about how important it is to pay attention to design elements in your visualization, how important and relevant it is to think about how your data is organized for understanding, and how relevant it is also to think about how to declutter your graphic, how to remove features in your display that don't have any sort of purpose. Let me show you just a couple of examples of what I mean, just to illustrate this principle. This chart that you have over here coming from the European Commission shows a particular variable. It doesn't really matter what it is the revenue to GDP ratio, blah, 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 country by country. Each one of these lines represents one country in Africa, right? So we have the variation of this variable on each country in Africa, year by year, from the year 2007 to the year 2014. And then also we have the average of all these countries, which is this dark pink line or purple line down here that says Sub-Saharan Africa. That's the average value of all these countries. Now, there's nothing wrong in this graphic in terms of choosing encoding. This is the right encoding for this data, right? We want to show change over time. Usually a line chart, a time series line chart is the best way to do that. The challenge over here for this chart, I believe, is not the encoding itself, is the way that things are arranged. The fact that all the lines are crammed into the same chart makes the chart hard to read because the lines overlap and obscure each other, right? So when this happens, we need to think about an alternative strategy. Usually what I do, by the way, in my own graphics is that first of all I try to show everything on the same chart. If that is possible, that's the right way to go. But in many cases you have so much data that if you try to cram it all into a single chart, the chart will be hard to read. In those cases it may be better to separate, organize the data in a different way. So an alternative design that I provided for this chart follows that principle. This chart that you have over here encodes exactly the same data that we had before. Each one of these panels that you have on the screen corresponds to one country. Each one of the panels reproduces all the lines that we had before, right? So they repeat the same lines over and over again. But here we use color to emphasize some countries in certain cases. For example, the first panel is the panel for Mauritania. We have all the countries in the background, grayed out. Then we have Mauritania highlighted in green. The line for Mauritania is highlighted in green. And then also we have a black line, and that's the average for all the countries in the mix. And then we repeat the same pattern over and over again. And on each one of the panels, we highlight a different country: Mozambique, Cape Verde, Senegal, Mali, and so on and so forth. Each one of the panels shows you the data for one particular country. But we still show all the countries on every one of those panels. It's only that we gray them out a little bit so they stay in the background. This is a graphic that displays exactly the same data as the one before, but it enables better understanding because it separates that a large amount of data and it chunks the data into smaller portions that are a little bit more digestible. It lets you focus your attention country by country and then see the patterns and trends on each one of these countries in comparison to the average line, which is the same on each one of these patterns. Another principle or rule of thumb in data visualization is to try to show things as directly as possible. Let me try to explain what I mean. For that, I'm going to show you another graphic designed by the statisticians that I mentioned previously, William Cleveland and Robert McGill, from another paper that they wrote together. So they were making this point. Let's imagine that you are comparing two different variables, the change of two different variables over time, for example. Remember, imagine that these lines are not labeled curve 1 and curve 2. Imagine that these are, for example, the unemployment rates in one country versus another country, country 1 and country 2, right? So unemployment, as you can see, goes up and then it goes down later on, right? All right, so the point that Cleveland and McGill made over here is that if you care about showing the unemployment on each one of these countries separately, then this is fine. You show one line for one country, another line for another country. But what about if the purpose of your visualization is not to show each one of these countries separately? What about if the purpose of the visualization is to show the difference between unemployment rate in one country versus another country? Then this graphic is not that effective, because it forces you to squint a little bit and use your fingers to estimate the distance between each one of these lines on each point in time. This is a great example to illustrate this principle of show things as directly as possible according to the purpose of the graphic. If the purpose of the visualization is to show the difference between the two countries or the two curves, plot the difference. Don't plot each one of the curves separately, right? As you can see, the difference between those two curves or those two countries in my made-up example goes down, right? The difference shrinks a little bit between one country and another country. Another principle of design in visualization is that we should always strive to declutter our graphics a little bit, right? So the way I do this is that I think whenever I design a chart in a software tool such as Flourish, the ones that you're going to learn this week, or Insight, or many other tools that I use every single day, is to take a look at the chart that comes out from the software and say, okay, so let's take a look at all these features. Does this feature have any purpose? Does this particular feature of object in the chart helps me understand the data better or makes the graphic beautiful, more beautiful? Because in that case, I will keep that element or that feature in the chart. But if a feature of element in the chart has no purpose whatsoever, it doesn't make your graphic more beautiful, it doesn't make your graphic more understandable, then that particular element in your chart has no purpose, and you can safely remove it because it has no purpose whatsoever. Let me show you an example. So this graphic over here shows you some sort of distribution of data, right? You have several bars that add up to 100%, right? And then you have the components of that 100%, right? So those little subdivisions show you how that 100% divides up into several different portions, right? This is called, by the way, a stacked bar graph. It shows how everything adds up to a total. Now, there's nothing wrong with the method of encoding over here, nothing wrong with the way that the chart has been created itself, but there are things that we could improve design-wise and in terms of decluttering the graphic. Just think about the many things here that we could safely remove without compromising the graphic at all. For example, the third dimension. There is not a reason why adding a third dimension to a graphic, to a chart like this, if that third dimension is not encoding anything. It makes the graphic actually harder to understand, because in order to estimate where each one of these bars sits in the background, you need to mentally project the boundary of each segment onto the background in order to calculate where that segment stands. So that makes the third dimension, makes your life harder. It makes the chart harder to decode and harder to read. Therefore, in my opinion, we can get rid of the third dimension in the chart. In general, I would say 99% of the time, third dimensions, 3D effects in charts have no purpose whatsoever, and you can safely remove them. They just clutter charts unnecessarily. Now, another thing that we could remove, or at least downplay a little bit, or make a little bit less visible, is grid lines. Grid lines in many software tools such as Excel or even Flourish or Insight, sometimes they are overemphasized. They have the same visual weight as the actual content of the data, and that should not happen. I am a fan of grid lines. I like to include grid lines in my graphics, but I try to use, first of all, as few grid lines as possible. Right? And second of all, I try to de-emphasize them so they stay a little bit in the background, so the actual data pops out and the grid lines stay in the little bit of the background, visually speaking. So if you take a look at this chart, for instance, you can compare it to the quick makeover that I made based on it, in which I proceeded this way. First of all, I removed the third dimension to make all the bars flat, and that makes things easier to understand. I created a better visual hierarchy on the legend, so I used two different font styles, right? One for the title and another one for the copy itself, and then I de-emphasized the grid lines by making them much thinner, much lighter, and also discontinuous. These are dotted lines, they are not continuous lines. That de-emphasizes the grid lines. We could also send the grid lines to the background, but I wanted to make the point that sometimes you want to bring the grid lines to the foreground if that really matters to you. There are certain circumstances in which this may be appropriate. In this case, it doesn't really matter. We could have sent the grid lines to the background as well, and it will be equally fine. But at least they are de-emphasized. They don't matter that much in comparison to the actual content of the graphic, which is the subdivisions of the graphic. Seeing this kind of before and after redesigns or makeovers can be highly educational. I have read a lot of them. I have learned a lot from other people's makeovers. If you want to take a look at more examples of this kind of process, I would recommend that you visit a website called Makeover Monday. Makeover Monday is a website that is run by by people who use a software tool called Tableau, and also people who work for Tableau software itself. And what they do every week is to pose a challenge to the community of people who follow this website. So they say, well, here's a data set, right? And try to come up with a good way of representing this data set. And then they post the results of that challenge. And that can be highly educational to see what solutions other people found to those challenges. But in other cases, they begin with an actual chart. They pick up a chart that for some reason they believe could use a little bit of improvement, some changes, and they made those changes. They make makeovers, right? That's the whole reason why this website is called Makeover Monday, right? So, and they show you the before and the after. Here's how the chart looked like before. Here's how it looks now, and they explain the reasons for those changes. So this could be very, very educational.